Along NATO's eastern edge, the temperature just went up again. Russia says nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles are now on combat duty in neighboring Belarus, and Moscow is issuing fresh warnings about what it calls a dangerous slide toward direct confrontation with the alliance. This is one of those weeks where the headlines move fast, but the underlying risk is simple. The closer Russian and NATO forces operate to each other, the smaller the margin for error. One misread radar track, one drone incident, one cyber attack blamed on the wrong actor, and leaders can find themselves forced into decisions they did not plan to make. Start with what's been publicly shown. On December 30th, Belarus released footage it said depicted Russian Oreshnik missile systems deployed on its territory, with Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko describing them as having entered service there. Reuters also reported the appearance of the systems, and the Associated Press reported Russian and Belarusian officials saying the missiles had entered active service in Belarus. Russia presents the Oreshnik as a new, hard-to-intercept hypersonic system that can carry conventional or nuclear warheads. In recent reporting, Russian officials have described speeds beyond Mach 10, and AP cited Russian claims of a range up to about 5,000 kilometers. Independent analysts and researchers have also been watching likely basing sites through satellite imagery, with Reuters reporting researchers identified a probable location at a former airbase in eastern Belarus. Now, why does Belarus matter so much? Belarus is not just another neighbor. It is tightly linked to Russia's military posture, and it sits closer to several NATO capitals and key transport corridors than many launch points inside Russia itself. If Moscow can credibly position longer-range systems there, it compresses warning times and forces NATO planners to assume less time for detection, decision, and response. That does not automatically mean an attack is imminent. Deployments can be political signals as much as battlefield assets. But the signal here is unmistakable. Russia is trying to remind NATO that escalation does not only run one direction, and that Moscow can generate new pressure points quickly and close to alliance borders. At the same time, Moscow is pushing a familiar line in its public diplomacy. Russian officials have repeatedly argued that NATO support for Ukraine and NATO military planning are bringing the two sides too close to a direct clash. In late December, a separate round of headlines centered on remarks attributed to Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, warning of catastrophic consequences if nuclear-armed powers end up in direct conflict. Listen carefully to the wording in those Russian warnings. They are typically framed as deterrence, not as an admission of panic. The Kremlin's message is designed to shape Western choices, slow down arms shipments, limit what weapons are used where, pull back on military infrastructure, and accept Russian demands about Europe's security architecture. But in Europe, the same message lands differently. For many NATO members, especially those on the eastern flank, these warnings are read not as defensive, but as coercive. The argument is that Moscow uses nuclear rhetoric and high-profile deployments to make neighbors feel unsafe, to fracture unity, and to test how far intimidation can go before it triggers a strong response. And that brings us to the second flashpoint that has fed this week's tension. On December 1, Reuters reported Russia condemned remarks by NATO's most senior military officer, Admiral Giuseppe Cavo Dragone, after he told the Financial Times that the alliance was examining how to respond more forcefully to hybrid threats, including the idea that a preemptive strike could, in some cases, be viewed as a defensive action. Russia called those comments irresponsible and escalatory, according to Reuters. The reason this exchange matters is that it moves the conversation from deterrence theory into thresholds and timing. Retaliation is one thing, preemption is another. Once major powers start debating preemption openly, every ambiguous incident becomes more dangerous. Hybrid attacks are the messy middle space between peace and open war. Think cyber intrusions, sabotage, disinformation, GPS jamming, suspicious fires, pressure on undersea infrastructure, and the kind of deniable operations that are difficult to attribute quickly in public. NATO has repeatedly accused Russia of reckless hybrid actions, while Moscow denies wrongdoing and accuses the West of its own covert campaigns. There's also a calendar effect. Early in the year, NATO countries tend to rotate forces and begin new exercise cycles. NATO's operational command listings show major allied activities running into the first quarter, including maritime and submarine warfare-related training that can overlap with areas of Russian naval interest. For Russia, NATO exercises are often used as proof of hostile intent. For NATO, exercises are presented as routine, defensive, and necessary, especially since Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine. The problem is that both narratives harden public opinion, and hardened public opinion gives leaders less political room to compromise in a crisis. NATO's political leadership has also been leaning into urgency. NATO statements from December meetings in Brussels emphasized the continued threat posed by Russia and highlighted airspace violations and cyberattacks as part of the alliance's warning picture. That language is meant to keep allies aligned on defense investment and preparedness. In Germany, Reuters reported Chancellor Friedrich Merz used his New Year address to urge Europe to assert itself more strongly, citing threats including Russian aggression, sabotage, espionage, and cyberattacks attributed to Russia. That is not just rhetoric. It reflects a broader European shift toward higher defense spending and longer-term industrial planning. So when you put the pieces together, you can see why the mood feels tense. Russia displays new missiles in Belarus. NATO debates how to deter hybrid operations. European leaders argue for a wartime mindset. None of those steps is, by itself, a declaration of war. But together, they narrow the space for miscalculation. Now, layer in the war in Ukraine, because it remains the main engine driving all of this. The battlefield has become intertwined with strategic messaging. Kyiv wants stronger security guarantees. Moscow wants limits on Western support and recognition of territorial demands. The longer the war runs, the more both sides seek leverage outside the front lines. In recent days, the Financial Times reported Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has pressed for long-term U.S. security guarantees, and other outlets have described ongoing talks and proposals circulating among partners. At the same time, the political environment in Washington and European capitals has been shifting, with leaders weighing how to sustain support while also exploring what a negotiated endgame could look like. This is also where information warfare intensifies. Russian media and officials have made claims about attacks and plots, while Ukraine and Western officials often dispute those claims or demand evidence. For example, late December coverage included a claim that a drone attack targeted a Putin residence, which the Kremlin did not substantiate publicly and which Ukraine denied. Stories like that can be used to justify escalation or to harden negotiating positions, whether or not the underlying incident is verified. And while the propaganda battles rage, the strategic reality remains. Russia wants to deter deep strikes and NATO involvement. NATO wants to deter any expansion of the war beyond Ukraine and assure member states that Article 5 is ironclad. Both sides rely on credibility, and credibility in deterrence often means being seen as willing to act. That is why new missile deployments carry psychological weight. Even if an Oreshnik system never fires, its presence can change planning assumptions. It forces NATO to think about air and missile defense coverage, dispersal, readiness, and what is protected first in a fast-moving scenario. It also matters because Belarus has become part of Russia's nuclear signaling framework. Russian leaders have spoken about extending nuclear doctrine and deterrence concepts in ways that include Belarus. Critics in Europe argue this turns Belarus into a forward platform and increases the number of launch points NATO must track during any crisis. There is an irony here. The more each side insists it is acting defensively, the more the other side interprets it as preparation for offense. That is the classic security dilemma. One side boosts readiness to feel safe. The other side sees the boost and feels threatened. Then both sides escalate to restore their sense of safety. The risk is not only strategic, it is operational. Over the Baltic and the Black Sea, aircraft and ships operate in close proximity. Near borders, air defense systems are on alert. Electronic warfare systems can interfere with signals and navigation. In that environment, an accident can look like intent, and intent can be misread as an accident. This is why crisis communication channels matter. In past decades, Moscow and Washington invested in hotlines, deconfliction mechanisms, and arms control frameworks designed to prevent a misstep from turning into catastrophe. Many of those frameworks have frayed or collapsed, and rebuilding them is politically hard in the middle of an active war. Yet even now, there is space for practical risk reduction. Clearer rules of the road for aircraft interceptions, more transparency around certain exercises, stronger channels to share information after a suspicious incident, especially one that could trigger panic in a member state. These are not glamorous steps. but they are the kind that stop a spark from becoming a fire. The debate over preemption shows how sensitive this moment is. In legal and military terms, preemption is always contested because it depends on the imminence of a threat. In political terms, it is even more dangerous because it can be sold domestically as strength even when it increases the chance of unintended escalation. If NATO moves toward a more proactive posture against hybrid threats, Moscow could respond with more aggressive signaling, more deployments, or more unconventional activity designed to probe alliance. Resolve. If Russia believes deterrence is slipping, it may lean harder on nuclear messaging, because nuclear messaging is one of the few levers that can create immediate fear without firing a shot. But nuclear messaging has a cost. It can backfire by convincing NATO publics that compromise is impossible and that deterrence must be strengthened. It can also push non-aligned countries and skeptical partners to reassess their distance from Moscow. And it can normalize a kind of rhetorical brinkmanship that is hard to walk back once it becomes routine. So what is happening inside the Kremlin as these messages go out? It is important not to overstate internal panic without evidence. What we can say is that Russia has multiple pressures at once: the demands of sustaining a long war, the need to keep domestic legitimacy, the economic strain of sanctions and military spending, and the requirement to manage an alliance system of its own that includes Belarus and other partners. In that environment, outward warnings serve several purposes. They rally domestic audiences around a siege mentality. They frame Russia as the party responding to threat rather than initiating it. And they aim to split Western coalitions by raising the perceived cost of continued support to Ukraine. For NATO, the challenge is equally complex. Alliance leaders must reassure the eastern flank without triggering unnecessary escalation. They must deal with hybrid threats that are real but often hard to prove publicly in real time. And they must avoid creating public expectations that every ambiguous incident will be met with an immediate, dramatic response. That is why you are hearing so much emphasis on resilience and preparedness. The goal is to deny Russia the ability to exploit ambiguity. If societies can keep functioning through cyber disruptions, disinformation spikes, and sabotage scares, then hybrid tactics lose their power. If allies coordinate quickly and speak with one voice, wedge strategies are less effective. Now, zoom out one step further. The strategic contest is not only about Ukraine and borders. It is also about industrial capacity, ammunition production, and long-term endurance. European governments are increasingly talking about ramping up production and rebuilding stockpiles. Russia, for its part, has shifted large parts of its economy toward war production and emphasizes its ability to sustain. Industrial endurance influences diplomacy. If one side believes it can outlast the other, it is less likely to compromise. If one side believes the other is rearming rapidly, it may try to lock in gains sooner. That is why both sides constantly broadcast statistics, capabilities, and red lines, even when outsiders cannot independently verify every claim. Where does this leave us this week, as tensions rise and warnings fly? The most concrete development is the reported deployment of Oreshnik systems in Belarus and the accompanying political messaging. The most politically significant development is the growing public debate inside NATO about how to respond to hybrid operations, including language that Russia can portray as aggressive. And the most consequential reality is that all of it is happening under the shadow of a war that still has no clearly agreed endpoint. Negotiations, proposals, and meetings may come and go, but until there is a durable settlement or a stable ceasefire, every side will keep trying to improve its position. So, what should you watch next? First, watch for confirmation and detail about where the Oreshnik systems are actually positioned, and whether they remain symbolic or become a sustained posture with rotations, basing, infrastructure, and training cycles. The difference between a display and a durable deployment is everything. Second, watch NATO messaging. Does the alliance clarify or walk back the language around preemption? Does it emphasize legal frameworks and collective decision-making? Or does it lean into ambiguity as part of deterrence? In deterrence, ambiguity can protect you, but it can also scare your adversary into acting first. Third, watch the rhythm of incidents. A spike in airspace confrontations, maritime close passes, cyber disruptions, or sabotage allegations can create a sense of inevitability. Even if no one intends escalation, a drumbeat of small events can trap leaders into believing escalation is already underway. Fourth, watch diplomacy. Reports have described further talks and meetings expected in early January and the outlines of possible security guarantees and ceasefire concepts. The details matter less than the direction. Are channels opening or closing? Are both sides preparing publics for compromise or preparing them for a longer fight? And finally, watch the language. When officials shift from warnings to deadlines, from deterrence to inevitability, from conditions to ultimatums, that is when the risk curve rises sharply. Right now, much of what we are hearing is still framed as deterrence and defense. But deterrence can slip into brinkmanship faster than people expect. Here's the bottom line tonight. Russia is signaling that it can raise the stakes near NATO borders, and it is doing so with the deployment it wants the world to see. NATO is signaling that it is considering stronger ways to counter the gray zone campaign it attributes to Moscow. Both sides insist they want to avoid direct war, yet both sides are also acting in ways that increase the chance of misinterpretation. In moments like this, the most dangerous story is not the one everyone sees coming. It is the one that begins as a minor incident, becomes a political test, and then escalates because no leader wants to be the first to back down. The next few weeks will be about whether deterrence holds, whether diplomacy can create breathing room, and whether both sides can manage their rivalry without stumbling into a crisis neither one can control.